Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have with us Mr. Wang, who is the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have with us Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, recently there was a senior apartment complex that's based in North Carolina that had a letter that had to be sent to it from an attorney specifying that they had violated their client's religious liberties under the Fair Housing Act. What actually ended up happening is you had a group of individuals who lived in this apartment complex. They wanted to have a Bible study. They advertised that they were having a Bible study, but then the owners of the apartment complex came back and said, no. You cannot use the word Bible in advertisement as it exists in this complex. They came back and said, why don't you just call it a spiritual service instead? Well, the individuals at the apartment complex decided, no, that's not comfortable for us. Let's all go to court and fight about this. You know, Tim, we're looking at something that's getting very interesting. We obviously know that there's always a lot of litigation that happens in our world, but now it looks like we're talking about the fact that if you use the Bible in an advertisement, in an apartment complex, and somebody comes back and say, I want you to use something different other than a Bible, I don't know if this is the type of thing we're going to be seeing over and over again, but it's unbelievable that we have to go and fight over these issues. What are your thoughts on that?
It really is, Orland, something extraordinary that we live in a time where someone who's a private citizen, this is not a government regulation prohibiting the word Bible. This is someone who owns an apartment complex who's decided for whatever reason that the term Bible is problematic for them and decides to tell the tenant that they have to call it something else. And, you know, when I think about this, I want to call it silly. I want to call it petty. But the sad reality is we live in a world now where we are so ideologically conditioned and so ideologically divided that someone would think, A, it's okay to exclude the word Bible, and B, that it's reasonable to enlist an army of lawyers to go to court and say that, you know, this is legally wrong. So I'm troubled by the fact that we go to such lengths over disagreements like this, something that could easily have been handled with a phone call. And by the way, I think that the landlord is legally speaking, right? I think the landlord is the owner of the apartment complex is wrong in making that kind of prohibition. But beyond the legalities of it, it's just an indication of how low we have sunk in society. And it's perhaps an indication of how badly we are conditioned to believe that it's okay to exclude the word Bible, and B, that it's also equally okay to go to court over it. So it's an indication of a new low that we've sunk to in our politics. And again, legally, I think the landlord is wrong, and that perhaps that will be demonstrated to be so in court. It's just sad that we have to go to court to get the landlord to see that. So this is something that's troubling all the way around for me.
You know, Tim Schultz, when you look at this, though, isn't this really what, you know, individuals are engaged in on a regular basis? You know, what I think is most important to me, and if you don't agree, let's go fight about it. Let somebody else decide.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously troubling when this happens. I think that most Christians in the United States, fortunately, don't have this experience. I think it just shows you, just on a practical level, how jarring it can be to experience a threat to your religious liberty and a way to live out your life in a way that conforms to your faith. I haven't tracked the entire sort of trajectory of this case, but I think there's a hint here that this case is never going to go to litigation. I actually really like it when lawyers' letters land and make the one side reconsider its position, because I'm pretty sure that if the apartment complex has lawyers, which I guess they do, they probably say, boy, we're going to lose if we go to court, and we also don't want the bad publicity, so just relent. And honestly, as much as I'm not a fan of litigation, I am a fan of the law. And I think that the Fair Housing Act protecting people from discrimination on the basis of religion is a really good law. And I think the fact that this law can have a force without ever actually having to step foot in court, if that is indeed what has happened here, I actually think that would be a pretty good outcome.
Todd, how do you weigh in on this? I mean, you're an individual who has to fight these type of issues regarding religious freedom on a regular basis. And some of this really is about what part of the country that you live in. The Bible in certain areas, no big deal. The Bible in other areas can be considered to be very offensive. I mean, is it really an issue in trying to make some clarification to be more non-quote unquote, religious or denominational in any way?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's interesting, right? This case came from South Carolina, so not exactly, part of the Bible Belt. But first of all, even within states that you consider part of the Bible Belt, there's a lot of regional differences in different towns. In fact, you'll see little blue islands in a red state, and oftentimes you can have, sort of a backlash there more than you would maybe even in a place that's less religious. I think my guess would be, and again, like Tim, I have not followed this litigation, but my guess would be this is a individual there in the apartment complex, in administration or whatever, who just, has made these decisions. I doubt this was, the product of a long conversation and consultation with lawyers, et cetera. And so I think what ACLJ is doing here, which is brushing them back from the plate, is good. It also, I think, does highlight, though, and if you read their letters carefully, they get around this, and I think Tim is ultimately right that that the Fair Housing Act does prohibit this, but the Fair Housing Act doesn't give as broad a protections as people might think. So there was a case up in Chicagoland a few years ago dealing with, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but the mezuzah, or the scriptures that the Jewish faith adherents will put on their door, and the apartment complex or condo place had banned all and anything on the outside of the door. And the courts up there said there was no obligation to accommodate this religious belief. And that needs to be fixed in the Fair Housing Act. We had a situation where a church member was required, this was a housing complex that also provides certain social support services. So there's a housing component, but then a social service component. And they required her to attend some meetings on Saturday, and she was uncomfortable with that. And the law in that area was not as careful. Now, just real quickly, a lot of these situations that ACLJ has taken, they will prohibit religious displays on the door, but then allow secular tracts and advertisements, but not religious ones. In those particular situations, that's not a failure to accommodate, that's just disparate treatment and discrimination, and does violate the Fair Housing Act. But we still need to fix this part of the law.
Well, Andre, what's the downside of just saying, listen, we're going to have a religious study? They didn't want the idea of the Bible. You have people who, quote unquote, are, agnostic, would rather not be seeing that anywhere. I mean, is it that big a deal to say, let's don't use Bible, let's don't use Quran, let's don't use, quote unquote, something that might be problematic? I mean, is there really a big issue with that? It's not like they said, don't have a Bible study, don't advertise, but we'd like you to use this phrase.
Right. Yeah, the property management company claims that since this community receives federal housing funds, that any references to religion are prohibited. And, the Fair Housing Act appears to be correctly applied here. The FHA is part of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, which protects residents from, among other things, discrimination based on religion. And so, I'm with, Dr. Golden. I don't know whether to label this as, petty, picayune, or whatever on the part of the property management. But this is not the apartment complex promoting or imposing a set of faith beliefs on its tenants. which, by the way, would also be a violation of the Fair Housing Act, but was merely an announcement in the community newsletter. Yeah. I mean, I believe the Fair Housing Act was correctly applied here, but also, as Todd mentioned, there are many parts of it where it needs to be corrected or is misapplied in other circumstances.
I mean, Orla, I actually think that probably what's really going on here, if you really sort of ask what's really happening here, is we have this whole era of the United States Supreme Court beginning in the 60s treating religion like asbestos, right? Religion is dangerous. It's just any mention of religion. So treating religion as something that really has to be privatized, and that any incidental mention of religion in public is really kind of almost dangerous, right? And so I think a whole generation of people imbibed this idea because the Supreme Court doesn't just decide our laws. It also has a big cultural impact on how people think about things. And so a certain percentage of Americans do view religion not just as something that annoys them, but as something that is a little akin to asbestos. And I would be willing to bet that whoever the small group of decision makers who made this decision are people who have that view of religion and we're seeking to misapply that idea in a concrete context.
I will say, and again, this is not legally defending the apartment complex, but we do see this allowed in other areas, right? So the Supreme Court has said that public transportation companies and similar type of entities can ban religious advertisements in their advertising. So that's being challenged right now, and there's people that want the Supreme Court to overrule that, and they may one day. But there is something to be said. The argument is, listen, religion is divisive. If you're going to allow the Christmas display, you're going to have to allow a lot of others, and that may upset people. We just want to keep this as advertising space. It's a limited public forum. So it's an idea that is built into the law. And as Tim said, that Supreme Court decision, if I remember correctly, does come from the 70s. And this idea that we're just going to become this fringe type of society of laissez-faire, not laissez-faire, forget the term, didn't take French, but just basically we're going to take religion out of public life.
I think that's where we are today, that the idea of separating religion out of public life is always going to be extremely difficult. But I think in the society we're in right now, this is going to be a fight we'll see more and more. There's an interesting case where the National Religious Broadcasters Association is suing the IRS over the Johnson Amendment. Apparently, the National Religious Broadcasting Association has a problem with a law that says if you're engaging in any activity as a nonprofit and you're supporting political candidates or just engaging in what we would call partisan politics, that you will be in violation of the Johnson Amendment. And what we have now is a group of 3 religious organizations that are arguing that this suit should be filed because the idea of not allowing all nonprofits, including churches, to be able to engage in whatever kind of political conversations that they'd like to engage in, and they should be free to do so without any punishment. And the lawyers in this case are basically saying, you know what, we are now ready to move forward because we think that there are some other nonprofit organizations like the Philadelphia Inquirer that endorse a candidate every year. So why can't churches do the same thing? Todd, when I look at this case, and we've talked about the Johnson Amendment for, since the 1950s, and even the idea why the Johnson Amendment even exists is a little bit, precarious from a political standpoint. But we now are starting to see churches wanting to flex and other nonprofit and charitable organizations say, why can't we get involved in politics from an overt standpoint and be as partisan as we'd like to be? Good idea, bad idea? What do you think, Todd?
Well, first, I just want to clarify, I have not been talking about the Johnson Amendment of the 50s. I wasn't born back then, so just to be clear. However, it has been a topic of discussion, especially in recent years. When it was passed back in 1954 and the years following, I don't think it was as controversial and didn't get as much attention. It was passed by Senator Lyndon Johnson then, supposedly because a church had ran against him or supported one of his opposition, and he kind of did this as sort of a retribution, which Johnson was kind of famous for. But at the time, churches and nonprofits were generally speaking staying out of the political sphere. That changed thanks in part to civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and then the, 1980s, rise of the religious right. All of that put together, I think, activated society and so on in a way that hadn't before. And it's only gotten more controversial. And the challenge is that, people don't, when they walk into church, sort of leave their beliefs and so forth at the door. And even if you say, well, churches shouldn't be engaged in partisan politics, okay, fine. But, on the right, probably the sine qua question would be abortion, right? So if you believe abortion is morally wrong, then why can't you advocate not to elect a person to office on the issue of abortion? And, while some people like to say, well, churches can still advocate on issues, but really advocating on issues, there's only so much you can move that needle, right? Where change happens isn't in the halls of Congress, it happens at the ballot box. And what happens in the halls of Congress simply reflects the election. And so the argument is by excluding churches and nonprofits from this conversation, you're really excluding them from part of society. And it is true that they're going to be governed by whatever laws are passed, right? I mean, while we do have First Amendment protections, the extent of those is limited, and there's other issues that may not directly affect the church, like abortion, that they may want to speak against. And so NAB has brought this. I'll talk about this later. I think they're going to have some legal challenges and problems with that, but maybe we can come back to that in a couple minutes.
Yeah, Todd, the intent of the law really was to help ensure that nonprofits are engaged in actual nonprofit work, while also promoting election integrity. So, we have, the law restricts 501c3 nonprofits from directly or indirectly participating in electoral activity, but specifically the endorsement or opposition of candidates, So, but on the other hand, to Todd's point, churches are organizations with positions and interests regarding matters of conscience and conviction. So, shouldn't all nonprofits have the constitutional right to express their position, on these issues? And to be clear, this is not to turn churches into lobbying organizations or give them the right to make political donations, but only to engage in political expression. And what is the most protected expression in the First Amendment? Viewpoint-based speech, right? So, but also, there should be, the other side will argue that there should be equal treatment of 501c3 entities. This lawsuit cites newspapers and journals. I think you mentioned, Orland, the Philadelphia Inquirer, organized under 501c3 status that do endorse political candidates. So I think this is a classic example of the First Amendment tension between free expression, free exercise, and government entanglement.
I've always thought that it's curious to me that there's nothing at all that prevents individuals in churches from having political views, expressing those views. And I've always been troubled by the desire to do that through this entity that we call the church. I mean, to me, you should, there's nothing that stops you from holding whatever views you have on abortion or any other political issue and voting your conscience. To me, the idea that the church should be recognized as an entity that essentially allows you to put forward a voice and be involved in politics in that way, to me has always bothered me a little bit. And to Todd's point earlier, when Todd first began talking, I'd agree with Todd that there are a number of things that led to this idea that religion is going to be more involved in public life. And one of the things that is often, and Todd mentioned this, that is often misunderstood is the civil rights movement. In a sense, the civil rights movement, or at least the 20th century iteration of it, because I think the civil rights movement is an ongoing thing. That's something we could talk about or not talk about later. But the point here is that the type of religion that you see in the civil rights movement is not the type of religion that you see from a lot of people today. In other words, when the church gathers to have, and in particular the Black church, which was the principal leader of the 20th century civil rights movement, when the Black church comes together in protest to stand up against Jim Crow or other organizations or other governmental practices that are oppressive or problematic, that is, I think, a prophetic impulse in religion that stands over against government and says, hey, you're doing the wrong thing. That's one kind of involvement of religion. But there's another kind of involvement that typically comes from a far right-wing ideology that says, hey, I want government to endorse my view of Christianity at the expense of other people. And if you're not a Christian, you can sort of get out of the way. And I think until we begin to distinguish those two different kinds of religion, we could be misled in thinking that the kind of religion involved in the civil rights movement is the same kind of religion that we get in our ideological debates today. They're both involved in politics, but for very different reasons and motivations. And I think that's important to distinguish in this conversation.
So I agree with Tim that those kinds of religion are different. I think, though, we don't want the government being the one to decide what kind of religion is good and what kind of, prophetic, and what kind of religion is bad. After all, government doesn't usually like the prophetic. They certainly didn't like the prophetic things they were hearing in the 1950s and 1960s from the Black church, right? And so having the government be the one that makes that decision is extremely problematic. And look, I also think good news is the Johnson Amendment is barely enforced, right? It's enforced sort of only in extreme and egregious cases where churches are sort of turned into political action committees. I mean, the truth is that there is quasi-political activity taking place all over the country in Black churches and white churches and everything in between, right? But there is this problem, I think, that the Johnson Amendment has created, again, back to our earlier discussion about the Supreme Court, a culture that you just don't want to ever talk about politics in church, right? And that impulse on the one hand can be good. You don't want to turn your church into a political rally. But at the same time, remember the National Association of Evangelicals abstained from weighing in on the justice issues around the civil rights movement, to I think their great shame and discredit and now regret, because of this ethos that's political, right? That's political. And we don't want to talk about politics in church. And I think that obviously this is a complicated conversation that the Christian church in particular, the faith I belong to, has been wrestling with ever since the beginning. What is our role vis-a-vis the state, right? And that's a complicated question about which really sincere people will disagree. But I think we don't want to create this idea that, especially as Christians, I think we all are on this panel Christians, right? That anything that touches on the political shouldn't be talked about at church because, the Christian gospel has political implications. The early thing that Christians said, Jesus is Lord, right? Christos Kyrios. That was a debater's point against the emperor cult that, Kaiser Kyrios or Caesar is Lord. So the very first Christian sort of universal statement was itself seen as dangerously political by those who said it and certainly by the Roman Empire.
Tim, the challenge has become as much like during the time back then. We have become so identified issues with a political party. Talking about that has become more and more difficult. There was a time in which there was such a thing as pro-life Democrats and pro-choice Republicans, right? Even though our current president by the time this airs denies that he was at one time a pro-choice Republican, the 45th and 47th president. But nowadays that doesn't exist. If you're a Democrat, you cannot be pro-life. You'll get ran out of the party. If you're a Republican, you have to be, you can't be pro-choice. And so it becomes harder and harder to speak out on issues and not be identified with one particular party. And Yeah.
There are plenty of pro-life Democrats. There just aren't very many in elected office anymore.
Well, yes, that's what I mean is you can't be in an elected office. Yes.
To Todd's point and to Tim's point, these issues are issues that require a lot of thought and a lot of nuance. And there's a sense in which Christianity, back to Tim Schultz's point, has in some sense always been political. I mean, the very mingling of eternity with time in the person of Jesus Christ, right, is seen in some circles, certainly in the view of the Romans, as a subversive political act. So there's a lot to be discussed here. And I think perhaps the best way to consider it is that as long as there's tension on both sides, we're probably getting it right. The minute we go too far to one side or the other, we're probably wrong.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but the irony of all of this is there was a time I worked in presidential politics and people said, you seem comfortable in this, and I told them that the politics in my church would make this look like child's play. So that's the irony of all of this, but we're gonna be fighting this fight for a long time. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
President Lyndon Johnson was a titanic figure without whom the 1964 Civil Rights Act probably would not have passed. On the other hand, if the Me Too sensibilities had applied in his time, which I think they should have, his political career would have been cut way short.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
The 19th century radical abolitionist Lysander Spooner, long before the days of law school and the bar exam, put up a shingle and dared to practice law in defiance of a state regulation that said you had to go to college in order to be a practicing lawyer. He was not disbarred. His law practice was allowed to remain open. And today he's celebrated as an American hero.
Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Title 26 of the U.S. Federal Code is better known as the Internal Revenue Code. It is over 70,000 pages long. Have a great day.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
We talk about nonprofits and you hear the term 501c3 a lot. There's a lot of other C's than just C3. In fact, over 20 of them. My favorite being the Cemetery Association. So there's more than one type of nonprofit.
Thank you for that one. Gentlemen, it's been great being with you today. Great conversation. Thanks again for you being here today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time. Hello, I'm Orland Johnson. I'm the host of Faith and Politics, your ultimate destination for a broad range of religious and political current events. Join me in a panel of experts as we dive into the latest religious news, dissect significant legal decisions, and navigate the complexities of politics. Stay informed, stay engaged, subscribe now.